Good afternoon. Like I said, my name is Rachel Neef, and I'm a second year PhD student. Though I think I checked my calendar, I have technically entered my third year. That sounds a bit scary, so I like to say second year PhD student at the University of Adelaide, living and working on Kaurna land. And I thank you all for being here today and being part of these conversations all week. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is part of a chapter in my PhD thesis. Anyone who's been in that space before, by their very nature, know it's a work in process. So I am really very open to any feedback, criticism, or any comments that you may have in that respect. But I do want to, begin from that part that this is not a set in stone piece of research at this stage, but hopefully very soon. In several discussions that I've had and panel sessions I've sat on this week, we've introduced the question of should we be looking at other technologies when we consider regulating SRM? What can we learn perhaps from nuclear or biotech, or AI has gotten quite a few mentions at the moment, and what can we learn from all of the successes or perhaps the failures for what that means for SRM governance? Today, in particular, hopefully from the title, I want to look at space law. To give you a bit of background as to how I arrived to space law as a topic, my original PhD thesis considered how would space-based SRM be governed? And so I went through the treaty law and associated instruments in that respect, and I found some really interesting and unique aspects of the space treaty and governance regimes that I thought might be useful beyond just space-based SRM. And so I broadened my question to look at how could we pull from these regimes, or how can we pull from the space regime? If there are any regime theorists in the room, I use the word regime quite loosely in a legal sense, not in that specific regime context. I will provide that caveat as well. But what can we learn from that regime that might have implications or might have instructive lessons for SRM? In this space, some scholars have already looked at the space law regime, but with a particular focus on the lens of liability. And so I want to broaden that discussion out today, looking at private actors. So why space law? There are obvious differences between SRM and space activities. I'm going to focus on the similarities because that helps my case a bit more. Both space activities and SRM necessarily operate in a global commons, and as part of that, there are key environmental, security, and geopolitical considerations that governance needs to address, and they also involve addressing the desires and hesitancies of a range of different actors. Why focus on private actors? We could have a very interesting ethical normative debate about whether or not we should have private activities in SRM. I'm sure it's a debate that's been going on quite a bit this week. I'm somewhat conveniently sidestepping that argument and just going from the fact that we already have private SRM activities, or attempts to have that. We have, I'm sure lots of you have seen Make Sunsets here today, or not here this week. The Israeli-US corporation Stardust is also pursuing, we think, some type of private SRM. It's a bit more unclear in that transparency. So regardless of whether we should have private SRM, the case is that we do, and therefore conversations about how that gets governed are already relevant. Existing proposals related to private governance often result in an IP conversation and about IP being some kind of de facto form of governance, and I don't think that's very helpful. IP really seeks to regulate property rights and interest in who can use that, as opposed to questions about oversight, about accountability. So I don't think the IP space is sufficient or the only place this conversation must take place. Oh no, not quite there. So instead today I'm going to look at international law. And again, that comes with all the caveats that we've heard about the limitations of international governance, about the difficulty that international governance might have. But I still think nonetheless we need to have these conversations if and when there is political will to mobilise for some kind of international consensus. There was a lot of historical context into how this provision came about, and that's really just the Cold War. There was a very deep ideological divide, as I'm sure is unsurprising, between the Soviet Union and the US and other Western states. Initially, the first drafts by the USSR of the Outer Space Treaty sought to ban all private activities in outer space. When introducing that, the Soviet delegate, quote, said, "If corporations could do as they wish, private capitalistic competition would displace international cooperation." The Czechoslovakia delegation expressed similar concerns that private firms would take improper risks for the sake of commercial profit. I'm not sure if this rings any bells for you, but I think these are very similar conversations to what we're having in SRM. However, Western countries, and most notably the US, just mainly because they had plans for commercial communication satellites, disrupted this. They wanted to see some role for private activities in space. As well, they were joined by the UK, France, and Canada, and eventually a compromise was reached where we have Article 6, which allows private activity with public responsibility. And as a concept in international law, this has been described by Bin Cheng, a very renowned space law scholar, as almost revolutionary. And to understand why that is, it's important to consider why the responsibility framework in international law. Under international law, a state as an actor is only responsible for breaches of international law if that breach is attributable to them. And that threshold for attribution is quite high. It requires effective control or that the actions have been directed. It's often quite a difficult thing to prove. And therefore, the fact that all private activities in outer space are automatically attributed to the state creates a level of accountability at an international level that was unseen of at that time for private activities and remains to be unseen. The practical flow-on consequences of this art is that if a private actor breaks some kind of international law in space, the state is responsible, whether that means through compensation, reparations, a cessation of activities. Again, the caveat of international law enforcement doesn't always work, but let's remain in the nice bubble for now. Moving quickly to that second limb, it requires that states authorise and supervise any private space activities. So there's no set requirement for how this must happen. It can be through executive action, legislative action, and that's the way that most states have taken it. Most states these days regulate their private space activities through some kind of space act. And what is really interesting about this is most states, in fact all states currently with the Space Law Act, have taken to prohibit space activities and then permit launches and create some kind of licensing scheme. So it means that private actors can't launch or operate space activities at a national level without private approval, and often these laws include reporting requirements, technical standards, and government oversight. I just want to link those two mechanisms together for a moment, in that under that first limb, we have a concept of state responsibility, and then under that second, we have a requirement for authorisation and supervision. And the argument might be, well, states could just authorise and supervise anything. They just need to tick a box. There's no requirements. But because of that concept of responsibility and also concepts of liability that exist, it incentivises good governance at a national level. For the most part, this provision has been quite successful at regulating commercial and private space activities, with the exception perhaps of the last 10 years, with the exception of maybe Mr. Musk. I hope he's not listening. But for the most part, there have been very few deviations from this. There have been a few rogue actors that have been dealt with quite swiftly. So what this might look like for SRM, how I would like to imagine some kind of legal instrument that mirrored an Article 6 provision would go along the lines of states shall bear international responsibility for national SRM activities, whether carried out by governmental agencies or non-government entities, and that such activities shall require authorisation and continuing supervision. This is definitely not comprehensive governance of private actors by no means, but it provides a baseline mechanism to ensure that private actors aren't operating without some kind of oversight and that someone is accountable, that being the state, when this goes wrong. There are, of course, challenges to such a mechanism. Would states be willing to accept such responsibility? Would they be happy to consent to such an agreement? would we even have some kind of international negotiation mechanism on SRM? I can't answer those questions. I can just look at some interesting legal analysis, and this is something that's been done quite a bit. And I think it's important to have these discussions early, so if and when that political will is there, we are ready, willing, and able to offer creative and innovative solutions. Don't want to hold the mic too much longer, so as some concluding thoughts to wrap up this conversation, I want to begin with the idea that space law offers a really unique real-world example of how we've dealt with private activities, but a range of other security environmental considerations in a global commons. It shows us that in this context, international accountability for private actors is possible. It also shows us that domestic implementation of international law can be incentivised through treaty structures, and this provides multi-scalar governance and oversight. And lastly, maybe as a bit of a caveat to this, no model is perfect to anything, and so I think we need to be okay with that. I think we are looking for perfect solutions in conversations about international law and governance, and I think this shows an imperfect solution where we allow private activities, but we constrain them in some ways, and I think we need to allow ourselves to wade into those murky waters a little bit more. So I'm going to leave that there. I'll open it up for just like a couple of questions, just in the interest of time, before we move to the next two presentations, if there are any at this stage. And if not, we can leave that for discussion at the end. And I'm very sorry about the slides. No, that's okay. That's all right. All right, so, yep. Yes, I'm not. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I've got them there. I just don't know how to get them up there.
That's an excellent question. I'll just grab the.
Oh, was there? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank you for your wonderful presentation, and I recognize my senior Honorable Margaret here. My name is Lulu Hayenga, and I'm a state counsel from Kenya. I think you're doing the thesis that I wish I will, no, but now I have to do something else. So the question is, do you deal with this from, you talked about domestic governance and international governance, and you said that the domestic governance, there's quite a lot of countries that have very good structures already in place. But when dealing with this, should we not start from the international governance? Either get in touch with the UN or you know, one institution that all the state, because it's not about private parties, it's about states. It's about states. The states are the ones who can then make the agreement with each other, and then they're the ones to manage the private parties. So when you look at this issue, do you see that we should start at the global level and funnel down, or do you see that we should start at the domestic level and funnel up? And if we do from the domestic level, could you please share with me some of the legislation that you have come across that manages this issue, please? But well done, whether you gave us slides or not.
No.
It's very grateful.
Well, thank you for your question. I think there are two ways I can answer this. What I think might happen and what I think I want to happen. I think in an ideal world, I would love us all to be sitting down and discussing this and having consensus at a state level in some kind of international forum, whether that be an existing forum or one that doesn't exist at this stage. I think that is incredibly an optimistic position to take. So I think it involves not just top-down governance, international to domestic to local, but also bottom-up, and that happening at a parallel time. To your second question, if I can clarify, do you mean national, like, so in the context of my presentation, do you mean national, like, space legislation, or, because yes? Yeah, so across, yeah, no. Yeah, so there's nothing in terms of like SRM specifically, but any state that has done any type of launch of a space rocket, satellite, payload, they all have domestic governance frameworks that tick that off in some way, but they're at various levels of complexity. But on that, I might hand over to Pietro, and we can continue the discussion after, perhaps.
Okay. So, is this working?
Sorry. I see, okay. Okay, now it works, I think.
Okay. Is it? Doesn't look like it is.
Interesting. Look at the idea again.
Yes. Sorry, but I would freestyle as she did, but there's some plots here, so that's not going to work. Anyway, yeah, so in the meantime, introductions. I am Pietro Andreoni from Politecnico di Milan and CMCC in Italy. And yeah, this is a little bit of two works that I'm presenting. One of them in currently in review and the other one going on. So it's going to be kind of a
Here we go.
Okay, cool. So what we plan to do here, I'm assuming that most of the crowd is on the social science side, so I'm going to try to be as not technical as possible, but please stop me if I am becoming technical because I don't want to do that. The objective of, this is a modeling study, our objective is to look at which characteristics, geographical, socioeconomic, and stuff like that, a coalition, and especially a small coalition of countries, needs to have, according, of course, to the models that we are going to use, to be effective or ineffective, desirable or undesirable. The kind of the starting point that we took when building this model is to recognize a series of physical facts about SAI deployment, which were relatively recently introduced in the climate literature, and the main thing being that depending where you do stratospheric aerosol injection, so where you do the SRM, and in particular at which latitude, you're going to get very different effects for temperature and precipitation and other relevant climate variables, which was kind of the theme or one of the big themes of this conference. So the different injection strategies for SAI are possible, and these strategies will produce dramatically different outcomes in terms of who gets the cooling, by how much, and how do precipitation change, and where, and which signs. So a lot can change. If you think about mitigation, it's kind of a one-dimensional problem, is how much you do it. If you think about SRM, is a multidimensional problem. It depends how it is done, and of course, and this is kind of the main assumption behind this work, different actors deploying geoengineering might have different incentive to do geoengineering in a different way. So some countries might be interested to deploying more in the north than in the south. Some country might be interested of deploying more or less. So depending on who does it, the strategy of deployment, not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of latitude of injection, might be different. Might be also forced by security constraints. So for example, if we imagine a country, especially a non-global superpower, that is trying to unilaterally start a deployment, then it might be the case that they might want to do so only where they can control the security of the injection infrastructure. And so the strategy of deployment could be different if done by different actors. And this can be a problem because one might believe, it's not a given, but there is good reason to believe that the preferences over the climate, basically, are or could be significantly different across actors, across states. So for example, the classical notion is that if you're a very cold country, you might enjoy a degree of warming for a variety of reasons. It's not a given, but it's a possibility for sure, and vice versa. If you're already a hot country, then warming is very damaging for you, and a similar argument can be made for precipitation. So some countries might prefer more precipitation, and some country slightly less if there is already a lot. So we try to build these facts in a model that is a country-level computational model that represents these dynamics and optimizes basically the level and the location of deployment depending on the state and the actor who decides to do it. And in the first paper that is currently in review, we look basically at how what are the effects of an injection strategy that is done by either a grand coalition of countries, so a perfect cooperation situation, or by unilateral countries that are only interested in themselves. And this is kind of the very high-level summary of what's going on. The y-axis is the GDP loss in 2100, so the higher, the worst, essentially. And you can see the line, which is the residual impacts that you get in a 1.5 degree scenario. So if you only have mitigation available, essentially, you still get some damages that are due to the fact that you still have a residual level of warming. And these damages are concentrated around tropical and equatorial countries. Now, if you do have SAI, solar geoengineering, well, stratospheric aerosol injection, and you do it perfectly, so caring about the global common good, then you get that these damages decrease significantly. So you have much less residual damages, as this is done via a overall symmetric injection strategy on the northern and southern hemisphere. But then what we see is that when only one country, we pick these 4 countries, which are the United States, China, India, and Brazil, because they have or they could deploy, gain the capability to deploy. And then you can see that you still see significant damages. This is from everything, so precipitation, temperature, and also deployment cost. And you can see in particular that the worst case is when a high latitude country or mid latitude country like the US or China perform the deployment, because essentially they underprovide geoengineering to the global south, where most of the damages from climate change are concentrated. What I want to see now is, okay, we have these 2 extremes of the possibility space. On the one hand, we have perfect cooperation, everyone is happy and everyone acts for the global good. Obviously, that word doesn't exist. But at the same time, even the idea that one country decides to deploy geoengineering unilaterally and to sustain that deployment for 100 years without any regard for the good of the bad or of the rest of the world is kind of an extreme situation. So these are 2 extremes of the possibility space. What we want to look here is what happens when you relax. So starting from the very pessimistic, let's say, scenario, moving towards a higher degree of cooperation, what happens to the desirability of the deployment? So you have in other words, do you need something very close to perfect cooperation to get a good deployment of SAI? Or is it enough to have only partial cooperation and few countries cooperating to get to a desirable level of deployment? So that's kind of the research question. Again, yeah, the methods, what we do is we build this model with basically at the country level with an emulator of geoengineering. Then I'm going to completely skip this, but basically we run a lot of simulations, like a bunch of simulations with different coalitions and different characteristics. And then we use some mathematical tools that I didn't develop, so I'm happy that this crowd is a social science crowd, so I don't have to go through the pain of pretending that I know what I'm saying here. But this is basically a method that allows you to understand which one of the inputs are more important to produce your output. So it's kind of a sensitivity analysis tool, if you are familiar with the term. And this is the result. So here we are crunching all the numbers. This is 1,000 of simulations or so. And these are the, on the x-axis, you have the dimensions that I am varying, which is a start. I plan to do more. But essentially, I'm varying the size of the coalition, which is the blue bars, so share of GDP and no, sorry, the purple is share of GDP and share of population, and the red is geographical characteristics of the coalition, and the higher the bar, the higher the importance of that factor into producing a desirable outcome or not, okay? And as you can see, the two important factors are the blue one, the last blue one, which is which of the countries that I mentioned above, so the US, China, Brazil, or India, are present in the coalition. So let's say which great power are present in the coalition. And the other very important factor is the mean latitude of the coalition. What do I mean by mean latitude of the coalition? Let's say that the coalition is composed by US and Brazil. The US is roughly 30 north, Brazil is roughly 10 south, more or less. You do the average and you will find yourself a little bit above the equator. And the average is weighted by population, so that if a state is more populous, they will weight more over the sum. Okay, so these are the two most important factors. So now I would like to see how the scenarios look in that space, and in particular plotting with the mean latitude. Now, if you've never seen something like that, this is something that I wish one random climate scientist did when I started working with SAI. This is how to read like any latitude over something graph. So imagine you have on the x-axis, you have the word, but it's flipped. And basically what you're doing is you're collapsing every point in the map to its latitude. So for example, again, Brazil is kind of like 10 south. And so what is going to happen is you're going to represent Brazil or the US or whatever else by their average latitude. Okay, and then on the y-axis, you have your variable of interest. So in this period, this is the same graph as before, but where the 4 unilateral deployers are plotted at their average latitude, roughly speaking. And as you can see, again, China and the United States, they are fairly dangerous as deployer, while Brazil and India, not so much so, and that's because they are interested in minimizing the precipitation change because they are very affected by precipitation changes at their latitude. But still not great. It could be better in terms of the amount of damages that these scenarios produce. Now, what happens once you start running a lot of scenarios with different possible coalitions? So each point is a coalition, is a run, is a scenario. And they vary by the amount of countries that they contain. But the green ones contain only Brazil, the yellow ones contain only India, the red ones contain only China, and the blue one contains only the United States. And you can see this kind of like smile shape where you have the bad scenarios, so the ones above the blue line, that are the more skewed either to the north or to the south, especially to the north. So the point here, the key point here is if the coalition is only composed by northern countries, so let's say Russia and Sweden or the US, then you might have a problem, because if they are all interested about themselves, which again is a simplification, but still, they are going to do geoengineering in a way that is bad essentially for tropical and equatorial country. Vice versa, if only Argentina and South Africa do geoengineering with their own interest in mind, then you might get residual damages to the north. So essentially, but there is a big area in the middle, which is centered around the equator and 20 north and the tropics, where you don't see basically scenarios, you see very little scenarios that go above the threshold of, let's say, danger, so to speak. And then what happens when you combine two or more of these countries, it happens that those scenarios tend to be grouped around a level of a level of damages that is very to relatively low. So as soon as you put together two of these countries with other possible countries, so as soon as you put together the US and India, or the US or Brazil, then what they do is that they need to care both to the interest of the United States, but also the interest of a big equatorial and tropical country. And what happens is that the global damages, as a consequence, even if they don't care about the world, the global damages go down significantly. And the more countries you have in the coalition, but up to 4, the more the global damages get close to the blue line. I don't know how much time I have. Is someone keeping the time? Okay, well then, just to conclude, well, this is to say that these damages are always concentrated into tropical and equatorial countries. So even when the damages are low, they are kind of concentrated there. So that's a robust pattern of vulnerability of tropical hot countries that are more affected by precipitation changes because they're more dependent on agriculture. But yeah, so the preliminary conclusions that I can give, this is, again, there's a lot of work to be done here, so it's kind of preliminary. But what I've seen for now is that the biggest factor is that the coalition that perform, even if it's a small coalition, so arguably a more feasible coalition, the key factor to its desirability for the general good, let's say, is that it contains at least one big power in the global south, which I guess goes very well with the theme of this conference. And that on the opposite side, that the riskier coalitions are the one that exclusively contain northern hemisphere countries, including the big powers, US. And China. And the other big finding is that I do find a lot of coalitions that, despite being very small, as long as they have the characteristics above, they are very close to the fully cooperative solution, which would indicate, again, this is a model, not reality, but would indicate that small and therefore more feasible coalitions could obtain a level of welfare gains that is similar to the perfect, idealized, and therefore impossible solution. So yeah, this is next steps. Again, this is more math and stuff. I want to do more things, but it's possible. I mean, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a fascinating presentation. I just have a clarificatory question. So you have the global GDP loss in 2100, and those percentages are like 5, 10, 15. These are quite large percentages for GDP loss.
I would argue that they're relatively small. It could be worse.
So is it...
I mean,
but I want to understand, what is it, a point loss, or it is like cumulative loss up to 2100?
It's a cumulative loss. So it's a percentage loss over the counterfactual GDP that you would have with no climate change and no nothing. That being said,
So say if it's 5% in 2100, that is, the total GDP would be 5% less in 2100.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which is not extreme. If you think about it, like the global GDP is expected to grow 2.5 times. So it's not extreme. The point is these functions, these damage functions, they come out of economic literature, so it's not that I made them up necessarily, but they are not to be trusted as that number is 10%. What I'm looking at here is within the same set of assumption of my model, if something is higher or lower, relatively speaking. The number is, you shouldn't focus on it. There are estimates that are much higher than this in terms of damages from climate change.
That was very interesting. But I thought I heard you say that it's what the GDP loss would be if there were no climate change. Did you mean if there were no geoengineering?
So the reference scenario, so the thing I'm doing the percentage against is if there was nothing. So I'm plotting against the GDP that you would have without climate change, without mitigation, without anything.
But then it would be interesting to see what modeling would show with climate change and geoengineering, or with climate change and no geoengineering.
So if you do a comparison without any climate policy and with climate change, the damages would be with this damage function an order of magnitude much higher. So this even the bad scenarios, so the unilateral scenarios, are not as bad as the doing nothing scenario. That's by far the worst case, and that remains to be the case. Here I'm taking kind of a high bar, if you think about it, because my blue line is the 1.5 degree with mitigation only, which is kind of the best case scenario in terms of mitigation outcome. So yes, it's risk, I call it risk, but it's not as much of a risk as pure climate change unmitigated, which I feel like at this point it's a finding in the literature that is quite robust, that geoengineering is better than doing nothing.
Is it all right if we hold your question to after? Actually, no, you know what, we've got time.
Yeah.
Why not? I think, why not?
Thank you so much, and
Thank
thank you for the presentations. I was so much interested in the cost-benefit climate economic modeling, and because it will really guide us on the way to go, especially the fact that is this SRM really worth the different climate change interventions that we are undertaking now. If you look at adaptation and mitigation interventions that we are taking now, is it worth going for SRM? So I was really interested in that cost-benefit climate whatever modeling, if it can be shown, or if there's where we can get more information.
Yeah, so the model is completely open source, so I can give you the information. That being said, these models are not meant to predict outcomes. They're very stylized. So this class of models is meant to explore big trade-offs between scenarios. There are other type of models that do a better job of actually, let's say, targeting or informing policy-making decisions in the near term. I would imagine this as a scenario planning exercise, maybe, so imagining possible futures, but I wouldn't recommend treating any of these particular numbers as something that, it is something that reflects some stylized facts and assumptions, but it's not something that should be used as, strictly speaking, a policy guide. In the sense that what I can say confidently is that the dynamic of the model is, if I do this, this becomes much worse, and if I do this, this becomes much better. But other than that, I'm very happy to share information, but yeah, just with the warning that this is a model that, I mean, models of this class have been used for policy analysis, but in my opinion, they shouldn't have. So for example, the social cost of carbon is derived from US policy out of the has been derived out of the DICE model, that might have worked in terms of the practicality of generating climate policy, but in terms of its scientific validity, I don't think I mean, that's my personal opinion, but I don't think that's the way these models should be used, to crunch a number and then to just condensate the number. These models should be used to evaluate different scenarios.
We might go to Axel just in the interest of time, and then if you have more questions after the fact, we can bring that discussion back together.
Thank you.
I think third time's a charm with the slides.
Good. Let's see whether we get somewhere. Would be good if the mouse would be working, which seems not to.
Oh gosh, where has it gone? Oh, there it is. Can we get some?
François, we need the technical support again. This is just stalled.
And to think we're trying to be in charge of the climate, we can't get a computer to work.
Apologies. Yeah, maybe just to put my talk in perspective. So I will look into policy instruments. So I will try to assess what are our experiences with policy instruments in case a policymaker decides that he wants to drive SRM deployment. And okay, yeah. Can you bring up the last slide set, please? Because the mouse is frozen. So this one here, please. This one. Good. And just check presentation mode. Good. I just check whether it moves. No, it does not move. Is it off? Okay. Good. Let's see. No.
PowerPoint open? Is the PowerPoint already there?
No, that's the other one. This one, that's the other one.
Sorry, guys. Just need to close everything quickly. Sorry for this now.
Good. Let's test it. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks for your patience. So, of course, well, if we have a policymaker that would decide on deploying SRM, of course, this would have to be done in the context of broader policies for climate change mitigation as a whole. And of course, then we get into this interesting question of competition between various options. So, of course, we have a wide array of climate policy, mitigation policy instruments that have been used over the last 3 decades. And a number of those instruments could theoretically apply also for incentivizing or bringing SRM deployment. For example, if I think about waste tariffs, there has been a lot of discussion that SRM could be treated like dealing with waste, and that, of course, would be a policy that could theoretically be applied. I also just, of course, note the survey we had earlier during this week that many people saying the policies needed to drive mitigation to levels where we would not need SRM are seen by many among the community here as very difficult to actually achieve the outcome. And of course, as an economist working and dabbling a bit in political science, I'm often seeing the situation that we have beautiful theories about the most effective policy instruments, and of course, these theories are very clear. So mitigation of climate change in the broadest sense, of course, would be seen as a public good. And for that, economists would say global carbon pricing is the best instrument. We see in mitigation, however, over the last 30 years, a wild mix of policy instruments has been actually implemented on national and regional levels. We see a few states that have carbon pricing, but even those don't have it for the entire economy. And this diffusion is rather slow. Many people were thinking, okay, if it's shown in 1 or 2 countries that it works, it will then diffuse rapidly, but this has not been the case. Why? Because we have important interest groups that influence the actual implementation of policy instruments, and we see very short-term windows of opportunities to make policymakers actually implement such instruments, and often these instruments will be skewed towards technology solutions that benefit the industries that actually are heavy emitters nowadays. Just as an example from Switzerland, in Switzerland we have a very high carbon tax on households, but the industries essentially for a long time were completely exempt. Now they are partially covered by emission trading, but that's only for the largest ones. And the medium-sized industries, they don't face really a carbon price. So I'll skip that one. I'll also just note that, of course, we've had the SAI technology session here, and it, of course, reinforced what I have here, maybe with some a bit older literature, that SAI would be probably 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than standard mitigation when you look at it in terms of effectiveness of suppressing climate change. So, of course, in such a situation, even if you have full liability for the side effects of SAI, it would definitely still remain quite attractive. For example, we know that in the context of mitigation policies for removals, we also have these issues of compensation if there are negative side effects. And even despite this being highly relevant, we've seen many projects with negative side effects. Still, these projects are being undertaken. So that, of course, brings me to the question, should there actually be a global market for mitigation units? So if we extend the economic argument coming from mitigation of greenhouse gases, should it be extended to the broad definition of addressing climate change? And that, of course, would then need a unit that is determined in radiation forcing. And we've seen one of the plenary discussions where it was said, yes, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, actually looked at that in 2019, but then they didn't pursue it further because they got a lot of flack and criticism on it. But principally, theoretically, if one would drive the economic argument for the assessment of policy instruments to its extreme, such a unit would be the most efficient one. But of course, we would have to cover the full liability for the negative impacts of SRM. And in that context, of course, we would probably see some shifts in the list of attractiveness of technologies. Now, of course, if we look into the political economy of policy instruments again, such a market is not very attractive. We would probably see the emitter lobbies trying to exploit new business opportunities. They, of course, would like to continue making profit, selling their equipment, and it would be probably quite attractive for these lobbies to go for both SAI or MCB, because it needs a lot of infrastructure, and this infrastructure is quite similar to the products that these industries have been selling in the past. So these lobbies would, of course, push for direct subsidies by government, and ideally subsidies that are allocated in a very opaque manner, so that the rents that the companies get from actually providing these technologies would not be visible. And we have, of course, this in the defense industry, military industrial complex, which generates very high profit margins. So to conclude, it is clear we have the international climate policy regime getting really messy. We have accelerating impacts. We have seemingly simple solutions like SAI becoming more attractive. It is rather unlikely, taking into account the political economy of policy instrument choice, that we will get rational instruments. So, of course, we would probably come towards a regime where these contracts are allocated by governments to their industries they want to actually thrive. Of course, the big question is, would the advantageous economics of the SAI option still sustain if there would be full liability for the side effects? I think one should do more studies on that. It has been only assessed at a very rough level. And how could we see the governance of global climate policy, including climate engineering solutions, mobilize a rational solution that does not jeopardize the future generations? Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for Axel specifically before I open up the floor for general? Oh, yes, sorry.
If there's someone else. No, someone else? Okay. Thanks, that was very interesting. So I guess there is a kind of hybrid model that one could fit in between, I agree, completely undesirable integration of potential SAI cooling something into existing carbon markets and mitigation, which would mess up the entirety of, I mean, it's not good, let's not do it. But in between that and like a military-style procurement of SAI, there could be potentially a kind of reverse auction type of structure, which would maintain competition and therefore, to a degree, efficiency potentially, and without having the type of like unilateral contracts that the defense have. Do you see that happening or not?
Well, that definitely would be the second best solution we should try to strive for if ever we come into the situation to see how deployment should be incentivized. And of course, the question would be who could administer such a system? Would we be able to have a really international level reverse auctioning system where, for example, a multilateral fund would be set up from which then the resources would be taken to prevent that we still have a skewing of the outcome if these auctions would be done on the national level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also one would probably need to design some sort of a like capacity market, because you need the redundancy to the infrastructure, so that would also be necessary ideally as an international structure to be able to.
Yeah, one would have, of course, to deal with that the initial costs for setting up the infrastructure will be quite significant, but then you need to ensure that that we don't get a termination, so that, of course, the ongoing operational costs somehow would be covered. Because so far reverse auctioning systems were quite successful for high initial investment but low operational cost situations like in renewable energy. How they fit to situations where we have significant operational costs, that's not so much researched.
Hello. Okay. Yeah, if you're using this mic, you just need to speak quite closely into it.
Thank you so much. I think to me, a lot is coming out. And I think I liked the last slide. It is talking so much. I think that is Axel.
Yep.
Aren't we opening a Pandora's box? And your last question here, which was saying, sorry, the last slide.
The last question was, how can we organize the governance in a way
Yes, that is a very
that
critical.
it's rational?
That's very critical and really touches me as a policymaker. How can we have a global climate policy governance and mobilize what is this? Sorry, I can't read it.
Mobilize globally rational
Yeah,
policy
so
instruments.
Yeah, that does not jeopardize future generations. We really need to think about our future generation. It's not about us today. What are we doing for our future generation? Why don't we move cautiously? Aren't we opening a Pandora's box? To me, that is a big question, which we should all think about, please, and then we move forward. I think we really need an international treaty regarding this SRM. This is something I really want to take home and see how we can work towards this. Thank you. The future generation should be considered right now. We cannot continue to really destroy the planet. We really need to think twice. What are we doing about this? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can't say much more than you say. Just to note, of course, your country, Kenya, is very active in Uganda, so apologies. The whole East African region is now getting really engaged in mitigation of all forms, both emission reduction and carbon removal. So I think your region can show the path that the South can provide really relevant solutions, and then hopefully we will never have to apply this.
Axel, thank you. I'm just curious about the use of mitigation markets as an analytical tool that you have used. So when CDM was designed, certain activities were kept out of the eligible list of projects. Nuclear was out of it. Many other large-scale projects which might have long-term implications were also kept out of the eligible project list. So I'm just curious, why do you think that including SAI within this mitigation market is likely to happen, particularly given that in the survey and in all the, narrative is that mitigation is first and SRM is only add-on. So, why?
Well, I said that would be the theoretical economist solution. If the world decides that SRM is a valid option and it wants to achieve this as the rational economist would want at the lowest cost, then we would have this. My conclusion is that it's extremely unlikely that we will have this, and we will have this very fragmented approach where each government would then try to dole out subsidies to a certain SRM service provider. Maybe if things work out well, one could organize it internationally, as just discussed with Pietro. But yeah, I think that this theoretical solution will never come to fruition.
If there, I might maybe pose, was there another question? Because if not, I might pose one to the room. Oh, that mic is loud. What I found really interesting about Axel and Pietro's presentations was we ended up with this discussion about likely scenarios about ideal scenarios and where that fits in. And maybe it's a chance, we've spoken a lot about narrative over the last couple of days, to throw to the room. As researchers, we are inherently also communicators and storytellers, and give us all an opportunity to reflect on, should we be talking about the ideal or the likely and the pragmatic, and what the implications of those choices might be. So I might throw that to all of you if you have any thoughts on that question that's come out of this discussion.
Well, so I think it's. Hello, hello. Okay. So I think it's useful to do the kind of ideal exercise that Axel showed in his presentation. I think as a person who lives very much in and has lived and worked in the pragmatic world, I think that as we consider, and people who are involved consider what to do with SRM and so forth, and very much including the governance side of this, that it be done not in a best case scenario, but in a what might work scenario, given all kinds of needs. And I'm deeply familiar with the UNFCCC, for example, and you could never get something like this moving through that body coherently. You couldn't get it moving through the UN. So I think you've got to, but you have to have credibility, and there are different kinds of potentially different effects in different regions. So it's very complicated. I don't know if you want a body that's sort of G20 sized, or is still smaller, or still bigger. But these are complicated calculations. But what I know is that it's going to. And I think before you get to a body of sort of decision makers, I think the need to have dialogue much broader. Like dialogue can cover all countries, but I think that you have to have a much smaller group, representative group, but a much smaller group if you have any hope of getting an agreement.
Just Todd, I totally agree, but of course one needs a lot of transparency, because we saw Paris. Why did Paris succeed? Because the small ones were feeling they are not outside the room. They got every evening the stock take. They felt being at the table. And I think if we can have a credible system that makes them feeling being at the table, I think this is a precondition.
I would say it's not just about make them feel like they are at the table, but being at the table to an extent. I'm not saying everyone, because everyone is impossible, I realize that. But again, the idea that, I mean, the fact is that power is concentrated in the global north, and population is much more distributed / concentrated in the global south. So I think I would be in favor of like a small coalition of capable countries, but I would also be very suspicious if that coalition of global small, I mean, the coalition is already small. It cannot be only representing a certain side of, so like.
No, but by representative, I mean of exactly the players you're talking about.
Yeah.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to add? No, I am conscious of time and the fact that this is our penultimate session and everyone's brains are, I'm sure if it's anything like mine, is the capacity for absorbing further information just slowly leaving me. So I'm very happy to conclude a few minutes early and make sure that we can all get an extra cup of tea or a cup of coffee in that extra break before, or a chance to speak to that person you've been meaning to speak to before the end of the conference. So thank you all very much for your engagement, particularly in this difficult time slot. And again, thank you to Ellen for once again helping out on the mics.